Hey, Jeff, thanks so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
I had the rare opportunity this weekend to stop by Philly, my hometown, and where you spent a lot of time.
Yeah.
You wouldn't believe the transformation of West Philadelphia. It's just a completely different place nowadays.
It's been a long time. I've been back a long time.
Well, if we jump right into it, many across the room are sales leaders, and they're in the throes of Q4 right now. And so it begs the question of the work you need to do and the focus you put on the immediate driving of the number with the long-term relationships you build with your customers. And love to hear from you a little bit on how you think about that tension of the number and the long-term partnership.
So it's interesting in the context of a sales relationship, that's where you want to focus. In the context of building a business, it's maximizing long-term value. And in that respect, they're actually quite analogous. So you've got quarterly numbers to hit if you're a public company or if you have quarterly targets. And yet at the end of the day, you're not trying to maximize value for any given quarter. You're trying to maximize value for a much longer term trajectory. And if you take your eye too far off that long-term ball, you're going to suffer in the immediate term as well. So, it's a very difficult balancing act, particularly for a sales leader or a sales team or a sales individual, where it's not just about maximizing the value of that long-term relationship, but it's also about the way in which individuals are compensated. I mean, there's a lot of factors that get into that, where I think people could end up making suboptimal decisions. But I would say, just like it is with how to build a company successfully, you really want to focus on, in this case, the long-term relationship and how are you maximizing value. And I think if you remain focused on that, and that is something that is genuine, it's not being done as a means to an end of trying to get the deal done and trying to get that incremental dollar of revenue. But if you're really thinking about the customer as a partner and someone you're trying to maximize value for, I think the rest of it takes care of itself.
Right, the long-term vision. And so all of us know that things don't go exactly how we planned. And could you share with us maybe a time when something didn't go exactly as you would have planned?
You want one thing?
Maybe just one.
Can you be more specific? Can you tighten that up? Give me a range. Give me some criteria to select from, because otherwise we'll be here all day.
Maybe as you're thinking about planning for the strategy of where something's going to go in the next year. So think about the past 3 years or so.
I mean, when do things go as planned is a more interesting question. So especially within our industry, in the tech industry, it's just become so dynamic and the rate of change continues to accelerate. I remember when I was younger, writing business plans. I wrote my first online business plan in December of 1994. It's a long time ago, and it was a I think it was like a 10-year plan or something, just absurd. And today, I think anything beyond 3 years is going to be highly uncertain. We focus on, from a planning perspective, there's different ways to approach it. We focus on macro issues and ultimately how we believe the world, the industry, and LinkedIn are going to evolve over a much longer time horizon. And then we kind of back into that via a strategy, our tactics, measurable goals. Over the last 3 years, I mean, one of the areas that it's not that it hasn't gone as expected, but I think it is a reminder of the importance of being patient. We acquired a company called Lynda, and the learning and development market is a massive, massive opportunity, enormously fragmented, still to a large extent highly antiquated as a business. And we picked up this incredible team and this wonderful content library, and we are in the process right now of migrating the legacy Lynda customers to a new learning platform that we developed called LinkedIn Learning. And you just have to remain patient. It takes time. Fully realizing the size of that opportunity requires patience. It's not going to happen overnight. As much as everyone would like to wave a magic wand and say we've solved it and we're going to be able to take X% of this massive addressable opportunity, I'm reminded all the time about the importance of remaining patient when it comes to realizing those longer-term goals and objectives. The flip side of that is that, again, because we operate in the tech industry and because it's so dynamic and because it's so incredibly competitive, if you are too patient and you don't feel a strong enough sense of urgency, more likely than not, the competition is going to realize the opportunity before you do. So while on the one hand, you want to remain patient, on the other hand, you have to remain patient with a fierce sense of urgency. It's a difficult balancing act.
Mm. And you said in businesses like ours, the 5-year outlook is sometimes too long. Just if we look back at the evolution of LinkedIn across the past 10 years, it's been quite dramatic. Would you go as far as saying that LinkedIn's become the marketplace for buyers and sellers?
We certainly are a marketplace for buyers and sellers. I think the goal is ultimately with regard to B2B transactions, and to some extent relative B2C transactions for professionals. We would certainly like to be a definitive marketplace. We want to make sure that any buyer, any seller of any ilk is able to complete a transaction and to ultimately make the right purchasing decision and to ultimately be able to target the right prospect and to be able to close that transaction. I think this idea of LinkedIn as a marketplace is a bit of a newer dynamic for us. The company was founded as a professional network, and networks have very specific design elements and very specific dynamics and very specific growth drivers. And as we started to become increasingly focused on building enterprise businesses on top of this platform, on top of this consumer platform that was oriented around being a professional network, we increasingly understood that we needed to nail down these marketplace dynamics. You need to balance supply and demand in order to have a thriving marketplace. And you need to consistently be thinking about how to fulfill both sides of that equation. So in that respect, the thinking has certainly evolved, and I think the team is making really good progress. On the marketing solutions front, the more engagement we see on LinkedIn, the more inventory is created, the more targeting capabilities we have for our marketing solutions partners, the more we think about generating the right level of return on investment, and then marrying that element of our business, the marketing solutions business, with the sales solutions business, so you can start to generate the right prospects and then target those prospects and then figure out the best way to connect with those prospects and ultimately close that deal. That's the marketplace that we'd like to see thriving on LinkedIn.
Yes, and Jonathan in the previous session was talking about the convergence of sales and marketing and how at LinkedIn we're working with our marketing solutions and LinkedIn sales solutions in order to bring that together. So a lot ahead for that. I think the audience would probably have my head if we went through this and we didn't talk about Microsoft at all. And in August of last year, we announced the combination of Sales Solution, Sales Navigator with Dynamics 365 as an offering, and just recently talked about LinkedIn data available in Office 365. And I know everyone just wants to know anything you can share on what you see as the future of what's coming next in those areas.
Sure, yeah, I can share a lot. So the primary rationale for the deal from LinkedIn's perspective was the benefit of massive scale. Microsoft has a global footprint of over 1 billion individual users of its software and increasingly its cloud. And I think Microsoft is in a position to really benefit by virtue of being able to leverage some of LinkedIn's unique assets, certainly our data, the identity information that we understand about our membership, the connections between members in order to create more personalized, more relevant experiences through Microsoft's products. And so you mentioned 2 examples. The first that we announced last year, which continues to evolve, is the seamless integration of Sales Navigator and Sales Intelligence into Dynamics CRM. The second that we recently announced at Microsoft's Ignite event down in Orlando was the integration of what we call profile cards into Outlook, so that when somebody emails you, you can roll over their name. And if you don't know who they are, you can immediately see what they do, where they work, their background, who you share in common in terms of mutual connections, content that they share. This is all publicly available information. If you want to opt out, you can, but it's all there on LinkedIn. It's just that in that context, it creates a lot of value in terms of better understanding who that person is. If you're about to meet with them, you can better prepare for your meeting. If you want to sell to them, you have far greater understanding of who they are and what they might be interested in, the best way to reach out to them. We're going to expand this idea of the profile card throughout the entire Office suite, ultimately. which I think has the potential to really facilitate collaboration and the way teams work together. Microsoft has their Teams product. Increasingly, you'll see the Office suite become more collaborative, more team-oriented. And again, because of this understanding of who our members are and how they relate to one another, how they're connected with one another, we think that can create a lot of value within the organization, within the enterprise. There's opportunities to seamlessly integrate some of that profile information into Azure Active Directory. And whereas most companies have a difficult time getting their employees to populate their profiles within the intranet, they are most definitely spending the time to populate their profiles on LinkedIn. They're highly incented to do so, and as a result, we think we can make it a richer experience within the enterprise in terms of understanding who you're working with, what skills they have, who to reach out to and when, how best to reach out to them. We've got some really exciting things in the works, a little premature to get into the specifics of, but with regard to ad sales and marketing solutions, the two companies combined a multi-billion-dollar ad sales business, which most people don't really think about. But between Microsoft's search business, its display business via MSN, and our sponsored content business, which continues to be our fastest growing business at scale, we think there's some really interesting ways of targeting folks on and off of Microsoft and LinkedIn that we could ultimately be able to further leverage. There's some really interesting opportunities within human capital management by virtue of Dynamics more broadly defined, not just Dynamics CRM, which is obviously highly relevant for this group, but Dynamics as a platform to support multiple business applications and our talent solutions business. We think there's some real opportunities there. There are some fun ones. Microsoft Word specifically is still the software of choice for people who want to create a resume. And so you could imagine going into Microsoft Word, starting to create your resume, and a side panel opening up where we can help you complete your resume by virtue of understanding all the optimal LinkedIn profile information and structures. We can leverage AI to make certain suggestions. We can recommend certain jobs to you, knowing what you do and what you're interested in doing. So those are a few examples.
Ah, so exciting, and hopefully that scratched the itch that I know a lot of you had in that question. And as we heard in the last, reason that people are going to respond to your salespeople is they see a connection in common, was that number two. And so being able to scroll over an Outlook and see right there the connection request should really help to increase the engagement of your sellers. And so we learned, Jeff, that you back in 1994, created the 5-year plan, and 5 years is too long for right now. But if you looked ahead, 2 to 3 years, how do you see LinkedIn evolving in that time?
So I think you're going to see us remain on a similar path with regard to the realization of our value propositions. It actually starts with our mission and our vision. Our mission to connect the world's professionals to make them more productive and successful. We now reach or have connected, we have over 500 million folks, roughly 530 million folks who signed up for LinkedIn. There's an addressable opportunity of roughly 770, 780 million knowledge workers in the world. So we're well down the path of at the highest level, the realization of that mission. Obviously, we want to create as much value for those folks as possible, and we've just begun to scratch the surface there. And we're doing that by increasingly engaging with our members, providing them the right business intelligence, sales intelligence. We're providing them the right content through a feed, which is becoming more relevant, more personalized, and we're seeing record levels of engagement there. We're facilitating communication between members via our messaging environment. We completely overhauled the old inbox, which was long overdue for a refresh. We are investing very heavily in the value prop to help our members get jobs and to help hiring managers and recruiters find the right prospects, to help marketers target the right prospects, to help salespeople target the right prospects. I talked about learning earlier. So you'll continue to see us invest very aggressively along those lines. And despite being at the company for almost 9 years, it'll be 9 years this December, we're starting to see some real acceleration and real momentum in the business. So you would think, being at the same company for so long, that you've seen it before. But in our business, virality plays a significant role. And the more we can get people engaged and connected, we get this flywheel spinning. And that's what's starting to happen more so than at any time since I've been at the company, which is incredibly exciting for the team and very gratifying. And the more we're able to engage our audience, the more successful we'll be in the realization of our vision. So if you're asking 3 years out, 5 years out, even 10 years out, while I would be a little hesitant to specifically forecast numbers, directionally I can tell you that it's all about operationalizing our vision, which is to create economic opportunity for every member of the global workforce. So while the mission is oriented towards knowledge workers and professionals, which remains our core and target audience, and there's roughly 780 million of those folks, there's over 3 billion people in the global workforce. And we want to create economic opportunity for every one of them. And roughly 5+ years ago, when we started talking about our vision externally and started to really craft a narrative around that, I think it was just that. I think it was a vision. I know it inspired all of us as employees of the company. But as we continued to make progress against the mission faster than we had expected, we started to turn our attention towards the realization of the vision and the operationalization of the vision. And we came up with a plan to develop the world's first economic graph, which is a digital mapping of the global economy. And that would be across 6 different pillars. So ultimately, we want there to be a profile on LinkedIn for every member of the global workforce, all 3 billion people. A profile for every company in the world. There's roughly 60 million companies when you include small, medium-sized businesses. A digital representation for every available job opportunity in the world, open job opportunity. There's roughly 20 million of those that can be digitally represented at any given time. We want there to be a digital representation for every skill required to obtain those job opportunities, and increasingly have coursework available so you can acquire the skill directly. A digital profile for every university, vocational training facility, or higher educational organization that enables individuals to acquire the skills to get the jobs offered by those companies. And the 6th pillar is a publishing platform that enables every individual, every company, and every university to share their professionally relevant knowledge if they're interested in doing so. And then the idea is to allow intellectual capital, working capital, human capital to flow to where it can best be leveraged. And in doing so, we hope to help lift and transform the global economy. And that was a vision. It was just that when we started talking about it. But we've made a lot of headway over the last 5 years. And I mentioned some of the numbers earlier, 530 million members. We have roughly 18 million plus companies that are represented on LinkedIn now, and that's growing really quickly. We've got roughly 12 million jobs available on LinkedIn. When I first started, December of 2008, we had 6,000 jobs on the site. So we're up to 12 million. And that was, in large part, a byproduct of getting serious about realizing this vision. 50,000 skills are represented on LinkedIn. We have Linda as a catalog for all that content. We're working with a huge number of coursework providers. We're an open ecosystem in that regard. And then we've got a publishing platform, and this publishing platform has generated 190 billion updates viewed over the last 12 months. And so we're making real progress against the realization of that vision, and in 3 years' time, we hope to be even further down the road.
Great. And you mentioned the learning platform twice so far, and would invite you to go a little bit deeper into how the learning platform is key to operationalizing the vision.
So one of the big challenges with regard to creating economic opportunity increasingly is the fact that by virtue of how quickly innovation is accelerating, the pace of change is accelerating, we see new skills required, new opportunities being created that rely on skills that a workforce in a given locality may not necessarily possess. So we see these skills gaps starting to occur. And here in the United States, you could almost throw a dart at the map of the US and you'd find a different city with a different skills gap. Detroit is a really good example of this. Detroit, as it transitions from a traditional manufacturing business to one that's far more oriented around software, for example, developing autonomous driving capabilities, there's just not enough people in Detroit to be able to, for example, evaluate the quality of the software that's being written. So you get these gaps, and we call them multiple skills gaps as opposed to a singular aggregate skills gap. And that's anywhere in any given locality where you have a supply-demand imbalance around a specific skill in a specific location at a specific time. Here in the Bay Area, not surprisingly, recruiters, HR recruiters, are in huge demand. There's not enough supply of them because of the rate of hiring, particularly in technology. So what do you do about these skills gaps? Well, it's our objective to ensure that companies recruiting folks, hiring managers, can understand what the fastest growing skills are within their organization, where the fastest growing number of jobs are within the organization, understand the skills required to obtain those jobs, evaluate the skills of their workforce, understand where any gaps exist, and where those gaps do exist, make sure those employees are being trained for the jobs that are and will be, and not just the jobs that once were. Similarly, we can do that for any given locality, not just the company, but any city, any country. We're working with governments increasingly, local governments, national governments, that are really interested in leveraging this economic graph data. So they can pick a locality and once again, understand any emerging skills gaps that exist. And then the ultimate goal is for us to be able to provide an API, and this may be a little longer term, but provide an API that enables them to then create just-in-time curriculums. So you can see where the jobs are, you can see the skills that are required to get these jobs, and you can start to pivot whatever kind of vocational training orientation you have, or even four-year universities can start to reorient themselves so that they can train people for the opportunities that are coming.
Wow, and this has been a lot of progress in the region I'm from, Asia Pacific, in this area. And as the leader of our Sales Navigator business in APAC, and with 2/3 of our members on LinkedIn outside of the US, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about your vision for outside of the US and the growth of LinkedIn, and what markets you think are particularly interesting.
Yeah, so well over 2/3 of our new signups come from outside the U.S. Our fastest growing markets are in outside the U.S. We're seeing a lot of growth and engagement in Europe right now. France in particular is a really interesting standout, but that's the case throughout Europe. China continues to be the fastest growing from a membership perspective. 1 in 5 of the 780 million knowledge workers I mentioned earlier, when you include students, 1 in 5 of our addressable opportunities in China. So that's a very important market for us. Germany is a primary engine of economic growth within Europe, so we're going to continue to focus there. We're interested in the opportunity in Japan, given what we believe could be the evolution of a culture that historically may not have been as open to the idea of networking, particularly networking for different kinds of jobs. But we think there are some really interesting opportunities there, and then the developing markets too. The Middle East, Latin and South America, Southeast Asia. I get requests almost by the week now by folks or from folks in Africa that are asking when we're going to open up offices. Nigeria tends to be near the top of the list of the people reaching out, so we'll see.
I've seen people commenting on your posts with those types of requests, so there's a lot of interest there. So we've talked about a lot of LinkedIn's business lines and the 6 pillars of the economic graph and all of the different countries. That's a lot out there. So how do you think about scaling an organization?
I think it's a great question, and one that I think is all too often overlooked, particularly in the earlier stages of hypergrowth, where people are just trying to keep up with demand and they're holding on, and that's when things are incredibly fun and exciting, and companies have a tendency to focus on the next innovation, the next new product, the next breakthrough that is going to take their growth to even greater heights. And I think that's when companies start to go off the rails, is when they become almost obsessed with maintaining hypergrowth and not thinking enough about the underlying foundation that will enable them to scale successfully. And one of my favorite metaphors for this is managing a hypergrowth company is like putting a rocket out into space. If you're off by inches in terms of your trajectory at launch, you could be off by miles once you reach your destination. And so you really have to focus on those core pillars of scale. So for me and LinkedIn, the areas that we focused on when I first joined, when I first got to LinkedIn December of 2008, we had 338 people, and we did about $78 million in revenue in 2008. So we're up to 11,000 people now. We'll do well north of $4 billion this year. And I think in part that was made possible by virtue of focusing on our talent, focusing on process, and focusing on infrastructure. And these are not the most glamorous parts of building a company, particularly when you're in the throes of hypergrowth. But without the, I think, proper focus
proportional focus on those areas relative to the rest of the business, relative to the investment you're making in research and development and new products, et cetera, or your go-to-market and you're keeping up with the demand through your sales force. You've just got to really focus on those three areas. Otherwise, it's so easy to go off the rails.
That's great. You mentioned they're not glamorous. One of my colleagues said last week when we were doing our prioritization exercise, brilliantly boring are some of the things we have to focus on to get...
And you know, it's interesting too, and I shouldn't perpetuate this idea that those things are unglamorous. I think they are what you make of them. And for those that don't know, at LinkedIn internally, when it comes to priorities, our top priorities, our team is our talent. And that doesn't have to be in any way, shape, or form an unglamorous thing. Building your talent brand, recruiting the right people, making sure that you're walking the walk on your culture and your values, investing in the right onboarding, learning and development, performance evaluation. Those things become so fundamental to an organization. I remember, had you asked me about culture and values roughly 12, 15 years ago, well before I got to LinkedIn, I probably would have rolled my eyes and cited a Dilbert comic strip. And today I would tell you it's probably our single most important competitive advantage. And there's nothing unglamorous about that. Process is what you make of it. You know, we can all lament process, and that's why a lot of people end up going to startups because they're trying to get away from process. But guess what happens when your startup's successful? It needs process. And as I'm always telling people in those situations, you can create whatever kind of process you want. You know, you don't have to succumb to the ways that things have been, especially when you were doing things in organizations that you didn't like and you ultimately left. You can create whatever process you want. It's your company. And that's an important part of our culture and our values is acting like an owner, not complaining about the way the company does something, but instead talking about the way we should be doing something. And then with regard to infrastructure, none of this is possible without the right infrastructure, none of it. And all too often, particularly within the tech industry, companies, hypergrowth companies in particular, have a tendency to accrue what we call tech debt. Because they're going so quickly, they're not paying enough attention to whether or not their underlying infrastructure and development tools are going to scale. They just want to pump out that next product, that next product, that next product, keep up with the competition. And at some point, you're going to have to pay for that. And you will accrue debt. And I understand why companies do this because they think it's the best way to remain competitive. But if you don't end up paying off that debt and hitting the pause button on future development to get your infrastructure right, then it could really cave in on itself. And so we were very fortunate to understand that and get that right. And that was roughly 5 or 6 years ago. That made all the difference in the world.
Yeah. It's been great, Jeff. Before we let you go, I just have to ask you if you'd be willing to share with us what the favorite sales pitch you've received since being CEO has been and what made it so memorable.
So I don't know that it's a live sales pitch per se, because for the most part, yeah, I've got an incredibly strong team. I'm so fortunate, privileged to work with the people that I do, but they're usually the folks on the receiving end of those pitches and making those purchasing decisions. But I will tell you, I'm not telling you this because of the event and because of our products and services. I will tell you that when social selling is done properly, I'm always impressed. I also always forward those emails onto our recruiters. So whenever I'm on the receiving end of someone trying to sell me something effectively, I'm always trying to recruit that person. And anytime someone, I'm saying this very publicly, I'm going to get just bombarded. Anytime someone takes the time, I'm lamenting this in real time as I'm doing this, I can't stop. Anytime someone takes, is that Gamson laughing somewhere? I can't even see him. I can hear Mike Gamson's laughter. When people take the time to check out my profile, understand what it is that I'm interested in, understanding the themes that I spend the most time talking about and writing about, that take the time to understand what LinkedIn is trying to accomplish, and they believe that their products and services are relevant and can create value, and they reach out and they say, hey, I noticed that you've been talking about this quite a bit, and I understand how important this theme is and where you're trying to take the company, and where I saw you commenting on this particular industry or company or product development, and I just wanted you to know we think we have something that could fit your needs. That always resonates. Now, I will say that is the rare exception rather than the rule. And I'm always surprised that that's the case. Someone should be creating some kind of hall of fame on spam and just how when you can, how quickly you can delete an email, how quickly you can, get rid of it. Calling me Jeffrey in an email where you're reaching out to me is a pretty good way to get me to delete it right away. It's a pretty good indication you don't know me very well. But there are others. Dear sir, to whom it may concern is not going to work. If anyone was, let me disavow you of that one. But there's all kinds of, I've sent you 6 emails prior to this one. I'm hoping you actually respond to this one. That's, hit delete on that one. How we doing on scheduling that meeting is another one of my favorites, where I'll hit delete when I have no idea who you are and have never discussed having a meeting with you. So the lion's share of the emails I get, the pitches I get, are along those lines. I could count on one hand the number of times someone has effectively reached out doing their homework, but it just cuts through the clutter like that.
Yeah. Well, let's try and build a hall of fame of the good emails. Unfortunately, there would be very few in that hall of fame right now. But on behalf of the group, I just want to say thanks, Jeff, so much.
Thanks for having me.